Okay, guys, good afternoon. Welcome to week 20 of FPA. Hope you all had a good start to the week. It was Valentine's, right? All right. Let's take a look at Yong Sing. Okay, I had put up some media articles. Again, I didn't have time to really go through, right? A lot of the articles from the last week, but I think there's a handful there. Yeah. Okay. This is for week 20, yes. Okay, let me just start at the bottom because I did let's see. Yeah. I I did look for updated news on Ukraine. So as you can see, Biden and Scholz, the German chancellor, right? Basically calling the Ukraine situation um, extremely serious, right? They are doubtful that Russia is really actually, pulling back or not moving forward with attacking Ukraine. Yeah. So that's just from overnight. Yeah. And then of course Blinken, right? The State Secretary Blinken, U.S. State Secretary Blinken, basically said that he's actually warning Russia against declaring the breakaway regions of Ukraine as independent. Yeah, because they seem to be in the lower house of parliament. They actually voted on Tuesday to ask Putin to recognize the self-declared the two republics. Yeah, but EU and of course now US is telling Russia not to follow through. Yeah. Okay, then let's move up. Okay, so basically Russia is claiming that, no, I mean saying that, US is saying that Russia's claim on withdrawing the troops from the border with Ukraine is actually false. They think that's a smokescreen, right? So he doesn't really think the US doesn't really think that Russia is withdrawing troops. Um, yeah, and they're saying that basically they are actually privately mobilizing for war. Although Putin has time and again said that he's not, you know, uh, he's not gonna be attacking Ukraine. Yeah. And basically, what Putin wants is to resolve the Ukraine NATO question now. That is what he's been saying that he wants, right? That's what he's been declaring that that's what he wants. But of course, U.S. is not moving on that. Yeah. So Putin has always said that he doesn't want to see, doesn't want a war in Europe, and so they've been still trying to work out some diplomatic um, negotiations, uh, trying to basically resolve it through diplomacy. Yeah, but Biden is not um, convinced. Yeah, and you see that basically this CNN um, article basically seems to suggest that Biden is using his historical understanding, right, his historical dealings with Russia, and using that lens, um, to interpret and to analyze what's going on today. So again, right, if you think about the historical perspectives of foreign policy, right, this is actually an example, right, illustration of how history does work, right? History does come into play in a decision maker's perceptions and decisions. Yeah. Okay, then this one is about Ukrainians, how they're actually trying to live with the uncertainty of a possible war, yeah. And how they're still trying to go around. I mean, uh, with life as is, right? As if it's normal. Okay, Myanmar says that it's skipping the ASEAN ministerial meeting. Yeah, not much of a surprise, yeah, because the military is not happy, right, that the generals were not invited to the ASEAN meeting. So they only extended uh, the invitation to a non-political Myanmar representative, just as it did the previous time as well. And so basically, ASEAN has not formally recognized the military government. Okay, then I forgot about this. Australia, as you know, the Prime Minister has been having Scott Morrison has been having a tough time with um, China, right? And now with last week, or was it the week before? Last week, I think. Beijing and Moscow basically becoming even more cozy, right? Banding together on the Ukraine crisis, on things, any international foreign policies, right? So basically, Australia's Prime Minister is saying that they are both banding together on the Ukraine crisis. So you probably should also look at this in light of what Scott Morrison is facing at the moment. Right, he is coming up um, for the for the national elections. Yeah, so he's actually trying to also drum up. I mean, divert probably a diversionary tactic as well. Divert attention to the foreign or international arena and you know trying to refocus the Australians on his international record instead. Yeah. Okay, Macron is expected to announce that France is withdrawing from Mali, right? And France has actually been in Mali for 9 years. Yeah? This comes about also because they France has been having a very rocky relationship with the military leaders. So the pullout would be um, will bring an end to the 9-year military mission. Okay, so that would also mean that the European Special Forces, the task force, would also leave Mali as well. Okay, Israeli Prime Minister Bennett is in Bahrain. Right? It's the first visit by an Israeli Prime Minister to the Gulf country. So basically, they had this is one of the things that came out of the Trump administration. Remember that they brokered a U.S. sponsored deal, right, between Israel and the Gulf, right? So this is a follow up to that um, deal, right? Strengthening, he's trying to strengthen bilateral ties with the Gulf countries, with the Gulf countries, and our reason also is because this is also in the wake of the U.S. shifting its attention away from the Middle East. Yeah, so you see with the lifting of the um, great powers, the power overlay on in the region, right? Um, you see the member countries of the region actually starting to interact a little bit more, trying to gingerly establish ties with each other. Okay, U.S. is going to be reopening its Solomon Islands embassy. Remember that Solomon Islands had some riots a couple of months ago, right? This is also in light of China's growing influence in the Solomon Islands. So this is uh, U.S. trying to basically you know uh, put its flag in in the region as well. Okay, so it's because Solomon Islands is the largest Pacific island nation um, without a U.S. embassy, so that's why they say that the U.S. State Department says that it has a strategic interest in enhancing their political, economic, and commercial relationships with Solomon Islands. Even the Peace Corps is also going to be planning to reopen an office in the island as well. All right. WTO case. As you know, Lithuania is caught in the diplomatic, what do you call it, conflict with China, right? Over its faux pas because it allowed Taiwan to open an embassy and to call it an embassy. And that triggered a backlash from China. So now the EU had taken up a trade case against China at the WTO because of Beijing's trade curbs on Lithuania. Now Taiwan is joining US and Australia in backing that trade case. Okay. Then there is Taliban. Taliban's asking Biden to reverse the decision to return only half of the frozen funds. Right. Basically, he decided to return only half of the $7 billion that uh, that Afghanistan had deposited in um, the US. So that's been frozen, but they are only freeing up half of it to help with the humanitarian crisis. Um, so basically, the Taliban is actually asking Biden to reverse his decision and to basically release all the funds to it. Okay, so I think these are all the, oh, there's another two. Okay, France is talking about the Iran nuclear deal, saying that Iran basically has only a few days to accept the deal on the nuclear program because they've been having talks, right, since last year. It hasn't really been moving forward much because Iran wants total lifting, right, of the economic sanctions, and also wants the U.S. Um, promise not to walk away from a, another deal again. So yeah, so they're saying that they need basically Iran to um, move forward, if it accepts the deal or not. Okay, and then there is uh, this article which was basically in New York Times, right? It was picked up by Straits Times. So it's talking about Russia, right? Putin actually expanding Russia's influence in Latin America. He's been speaking to quite a number of the um, the heads of states there. Nicaragua's president. He also called on Venezuela and Cuba, and he also hosted the president of Argentina just recently. Right, so that's been. I mean, it's kind of like a marathon. Yeah, he's actually going through the different heads of states, drumming up support, maybe reestablishing ties, and further strengthening ties with the Latin American states. Bolsonaro was also the Mexican president was also. I mean, sorry, Brazilian president was also in Moscow, yeah, and met with Putin as well. So basically, you see a strengthening of ties, especially with strongman uh, leaders in Latin America. So that's, and of course, Russia's been also at the forefront with its vaccine diplomacy as well in Latin America. Okay, so those are the articles that I have for you guys today. Anything else that you guys saw? Any other articles maybe that you guys saw that I didn't pick up because I didn't have time to actually go through and scan um, all the media articles, and I didn't look at foreign affairs as well. I don't know whether the foreign affairs magazine these few weeks have had anything that is interesting. Okay, Yipeng has something. Eh? Ah, okay, more about Ukraine. Enemies are my enemy. Oh, okay. So this is about China trying to basically redefine or forge a new international order. Yeah, part of the hang up about China, right, is also the fact that that the possibility that China is going to be redefining the international order, right, and that would mean that you know the previous major powers of the of if let's say it succeeds right in redefining the international order, the previous major powers would be at the losing end. Very hawkish view. Eh? Yeah, I think that probably. I mean, it's also a very realist position as well because it's a zero sum game. I mean, most would see it as a zero sum game. All right. There's also something I think on Ukraine as well on in foreign affairs. And the other one that I was going to look at was world politics review, but I forgot to look through and see if there's anything there. The other one is the diplomat. Um, yeah, I haven't looked at the diplomat either. But this particular this one looks like pretty good. How to make a deal with Putin if you're interested in looking at how they should. I mean, the MacFalls look at what needs to be done to basically assuage Russia's or Putin's uh, um, concerns, right? And to basically avoid um, a war. So this might be a good read as well. The other one that, yeah, like I said, you might want to look at the World Politics Review or even the Diplomat. I didn't have time to go through the Diplomat today, but sometimes they do have pretty interesting um, articles. Okay, that's it. All right, let's take a look at what we are supposed to do for today. Right, yeah, so we're going to be continuing with what we um, where we left off last week, looking at states in transition. So remember that we talked about how foreign policy analysis has been basically pretty silent, right, on foreign policy change. Right? It's interesting that we are. I mean, with foreign policy analysis, you're analyzing how decisions are made. You're analyzing the decision making process, but nothing is very little has been done, or at least in the 1990s. Right, very little was done at that point in time. Uh, about how we should how does foreign policy change. So basically, quite a number of scholars since then have said that Herman was the first to actually point this out, that foreign policy analysis, the foreign policy studies not very well equipped to explain foreign policy change, because we always assume that foreign policy is static. And whatever, if you make changes, you are unlikely to make radical changes to foreign policy, right? Even when there's a change in government, right? Even with a change in government, the likelihood of the government actually following the previous government's policies seem to be uh, more. There seems to be a higher probability of that happening, or if there's a radical shift, right, it will actually revert back to normalcy sometime. An assumption of some sort of equilibrium state, right, to foreign policy. So Charles Herman, right, he basically proposed that there are actually four graduated levels of foreign policy change. So last week we looked at adjustment change, right, which basically he sees it as very marginal. And he actually doesn't discuss adjustment change as as leading to a foreign policy change. In fact, he said that real foreign policy change only comes about with program change, or problem goal change, or international or reorientation change. Yeah, so basically the methods, whether you're changing the tools of diplomacy that you're using, you're using different tools altogether, right, to achieve the end goal that you have defined, right? So your end goal hasn't changed, but you just changed the methods of getting there, or you may have actually changed the goal, right, the ends, and so that requires a relook at um, the whole problem and how to get to resolving that problem. What methods to use to resolving the problem. And then when you have an international reorientation change that's seen as the most extreme, it will require a revamp of the foreign policy framework, revamp of foreign policies with different states at the same time. So it's a simultaneous foreign policy change across different countries, different um, um, significant other states. Yeah. Um, and then he also pointed out that there are actually four theoretical frameworks that you could actually use to examine these changes. Right. He says that these four theoretical frameworks can be mapped to these changes. So basically, domestic political systems, changes within the domestic political systems, the reorientation within the domestic policy systems that may have triggered a change, either in the change of regime or change in government or change in the major domestic groups that have political power. Yeah. It could also be a bureaucratic decision making change. It could be cybernetics that could result in different information, right? Horizon scanning, different information coming into play, which may change the schema or schemata of the decision maker. Right? And then you might have learning approaches that come in to show how um, policymakers may have actually learned from past, right, learn from history, and that may color their perception and the strategies that they have decided to use, right, to resolve the current situation, the current foreign policy problem, or to achieve the current foreign policy goal. Yeah. Okay, so basically, the scholars that we looked at like Herman, right, was looking at, I mean, when he talked about domestic political system change, right, it would be possibly looking at a regime change, right? So basically, transitional states were actually viewed as basically the best um, case study for understanding foreign policy change. And that's where Alison Stanger came in, right? Remember we talked about Alison Stanger, and she talked about transitional states. Yeah? So this is actually something I took out from last week's PowerPoint slides. And so I guess you recall that we talked about this, that um, when states are transitioning from one political regime to another, there's basically a dissolution of one regime and then a replacement of that regime with another one, right? Often it's an authoritarian regime that's dissolved and replaced by a democratic regime, right? In the interim, right, you will have interim governments that guide the transition, right? So that's where you have different types of governments, right? If it's like what we see as a transformational change, right? What Huntington defines a transformational change, Linz sees that the government that takes over is actually an incumbent caretaker government, basically um, having some sort of uh, uh, connection with the previous regime. Yeah? When it's a replacement government, right, that's where you have a revolution, a breakdown or collapse of of the previous regime. You have what Linz would see as a revolutionary provisional government. When you have basically power sharing, right? I mean, you have basically a mix of the old and the new elites, right, coming in to the government, the transitional government. That would be what Linz would see as power sharing interim governments. So when Stanger looked at the different regimes, right, she said she saw that basically, based on regime type, right, the likely foreign policy would actually also change, right? So if you have a revolutionary regime, revolutionary provisional regime, right, where a revolution actually ousted the previous regime, right, you will see that the transitional government would likely want to have a break from the past, so the foreign policy would likely be a clean break from the past as well. So they will probably replace all the previous regime's foreign policy. When you have a power sharing interim government where you have a mix of the old and the new and elites and they have to balance each other out, right? It would You would find that the foreign policy would be contingent on what's happening, dependent on the circumstances, the situation at hand. And then if you have an interim government, interim caretaker government, which is basically um, you have the hangover of elites from the previous regime, right, you see that they are less likely to tweak with the foreign policy. Right, there will be more of an emphasis on continuity with the past, and so you will see that foreign policy will likely continue, right, from the previous regime to the current caretaker government. Okay, so that's what Stanger had outlined here. Now, I decided to use Gorjal first because Gorjal actually did a critique of Stanger. Yeah. So Gorjal basically critiqued Stanger's model and said that basically it doesn't satisfactorily explain how and the transition governments actually select what foreign policy issues to act on, what foreign policy issues to change, right? What foreign policy issues to continue from the past. Yeah, because he noted that even though Stanger says right, revolutionary governments actually would change all the existing foreign policies, um, because they want a clean break from the past, right? Gojal says that no, we have no the particular case that he's looking at, right, which is a disconfirming case, shows that even when you have revolutionary government, it doesn't always reorient all the existing foreign policies. It doesn't always change all the existing foreign policies and have a clean break from the past. It may actually keep some of the foreign policies intact. And even when you have incumbent caretaker governments, right, they do not always keep the previous regime's foreign policy, and it may not be a continuous uh, um, uh, a, a continuity in the foreign policy, right, between the previous regime and the incumbent government. Rather, sometimes they do undertake major foreign policy initiatives. So they may actually, do a 180-degree, change to a particular foreign policy, for example. So basically, what Gorja was saying is that the nature of interim government is not the main variable, which is what Stanjo was saying in her article. He said that basically the nature of the interim government, whether it is a revolutionary government, an incumbent caretaker government, or a power sharing government, it doesn't, it's not the main variable for explaining foreign policy initiatives or the absence of it during the time of this transition government. Okay, so basically, Godra actually looks at whether or not the foreign policy, what are the perceptions of the foreign policy from the international community and within the domestic population, right? Whether or not they see the foreign policy as legitimate or illegitimate. Yeah. So basically, when I think I didn't did I define the what it means to be legitimate? Okay. Yeah, I did. Okay, so basically, if you look at international perspective, right, the scenario one, right, a foreign policy could be seen as legitimate internationally, right, by the international community. Domestically, the domestic population, the domestic audience, right, the supporters of the new regime, for example, they may also view it as legitimate. So, um, there's there's actually high benefits of continuing with the foreign policy of the previous regime, for example. Low cost in actually continuing with it. So the likelihood of a policy change when it's deemed as legitimate by the international community as well as the domestic audience, right? The likelihood that the policy will change is very low. Yeah. Scenario two is where the international perspective sees the foreign policy as legitimate, but domestic audience sees it as illegitimate, right? So if let's say it's viewed that the cost of changing, right, the policy, or the cost of continuing with the policy is minor, right, the likelihood of policy change is low. But if the cost is high, then the likelihood of policy change would be very high. The probability that the foreign policy will change is high. And so when you look at international perspective, you will see that, right, sometimes the international community may view a foreign policy as legitimate, and the domestic audience may view it as illegitimate. Right? That's where it is very difficult to predict which way you go. So you need to look at cost benefit analysis. Same with when a foreign policy is seen by the international community as illegitimate, but domestic audience actually sees it as legitimate. Again, it's also very difficult to tell which way the cookie will crumble. You need to actually evaluate, do a cost benefit evaluation. You know? Then, of course, when a foreign policy is viewed by both the international audience as well as the domestic audience as illegitimate, right, there is very little benefit with continuing with it. In fact, there's high cost of continuation. That's where the policy change is likely, very likely, highly likely. Yeah. So when we talk about costs, right, the cost could be in terms of international political condemnation for following through with a foreign policy or continuing with a foreign policy, or if let's say and from the domestic perspective, right, the cost that could arise from continuation of a foreign policy that's deemed as illegitimate could be that there might be domestic turmoil, political turmoil. Yeah, so that's why the cost would be high for the interim government, because they want stability over during the transitional period. Okay, so this is let me see. I think I didn't actually define what it means to be. Yeah, I think I didn't define what it means to be legitimate. But actually, Gojrao did mention it in his article. Yeah, so you can actually look it up. Let's see. Yeah, I can't find it right now, but you can look it up. Okay, so if a policy is viewed as, like I said, if the policy is viewed as domestically legitimate but internationally illegitimate, right? The possibility of change could be there, but it may be cosmetic changes just to address the international condemnation, right? So that you actually, satisfy the international community. Yeah. But if let's say it so happens that when you do make the cosmetic changes, it does inflict costs on your domestic group that actually supports the government, the interim government, right? Then how these supporters react will be actually a determining factor to the subsequent policy direction, because the leaders, right, in an interim government is actually quite shaky, right? So they will need to draw as much as possible on their domestic support base. So if the domestic groups that form the support base actually have, are inflicted with a cost as a result of the cosmetic changes that they are making to the foreign policy, right? Of course, the leaders will try to then, pander to the domestic supporters. Yeah. So if the government in question, right, if it's the interim government is actually more authoritarian, it's likely to respond to criticisms in two ways. One is to denounce the international criticism, right, as an unacceptable violation of its national sovereignty. So they will basically, go aggressive and basically aggressively address all those criticisms. Or they may appeal to another principle, right, conflicting principle that is actually seen as um, more important, right? Appeal to an international principle that is more important and would override the criticisms that the international community may have. You know? So these are the two ways that the government may respond to criticisms, and that's basically the reason why they may respond this way is basically because they want to quash any suggestions that the international criticism is actually an indicator that its external legitimacy is being challenged. Because it needs to also um, assert its legitimacy, especially for interim governments. Yeah. Um, so what this also suggests is that likelihood of a foreign policy change is going to be quite low, because the government, the interim government or whatever, the transitional government will still want to um, reinforce its sovereign right, yeah, and its legitimacy. So it will not want to make major reversals. Yeah? So any major reversals of foreign policy can only take place if there's a further change in the regime. Yeah. Um, yeah. So if let's say there is another thing that Gojrao also observed is that if let's say there are high costs, right, inflicted on the elites and the domestic population before the democratic transition, because of the result of the international criticism of the foreign policy that it had in place, right, there will be a greater probability that the foreign policy will be changed during the transition. Okay, so this is what Gojrao said. Basically, he is shifting the attention from the type of interim government that is in place and its impact on foreign policy, which is what Stenger had set out to do. He's shifting that attention to the balance of power instead between within the domestic arena, right, between different individual and corporate evaluations and strategies, right? He says that will decide which policies are changed and to what extent. Yeah. So he noted that in the transition, right, the transition may elevate new actors to positions of power and influence, or give to the previous actors a revised set of evaluations and strategies. So it's even possible that regime change provides just the opportunity to implement policy innovations that were desired but not enacted by the preceding authoritarian regime. Yeah. So basically, he's saying that the change arises from within, right, from the balance of power, or the, um, how um, the uh, domestic groups, right, with the new political domestic groups, how they are actually jostling for power, right, in the interim. Okay, so when both the individual and corporate actors, for example, the military, right, actually have shared interests and see greater benefits in changing the foreign policy, that's when you will see changes being more likely. Yeah, but it will be more problematic if the individual and corporate actors actually disagree. So, when you think about individual and corporate actors, you can think about it in terms of individual leaders, you could think about it in terms of bureaucracy, you could also think about it in terms of military, right? Basically, the key political actors, yeah, within the domestic arena. All right. Gorgel talks about East Timor. Yeah. So that's so I wanted to just show you basically the Guardian actually did quite a good job of summarizing, right, the East Timor's struggle for independence from under its basically it's a historical look back to East Timor under the Portuguese colonial masters, and then after that, when Indonesia took over and annexed East Timor, and then subsequently, right, when Indonesia had transitioned, right, to a more democratic regime, with the fall of Suharto, the impact on East Timor. Yeah.
After nearly 300 years of colonial rule, Portugal withdraws from East Timor, sparking a bitter rivalry between local groups. Goes into action. After months of chaos, Fretilin forces declare East Timor independent in November 1975. 9 days later, Indonesia invades. As the world largely looks the other way, tens of thousands of East Timorese will die. Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser is the first to recognise Jakarta's de facto annexation, but the UN condemns it and calls for an act of self-determination. Despite staged visits like this one, Indonesia's President Suharto oversees a brutal regime of occupation. Away from the official cameras, fighting, massacres, torture and starvation kill as many as 200,000 people over the next 2 decades. In 1991, shocking footage emerges of the Santa Cruz Massacre. 100 people slaughtered at a funeral procession in the capital. It's a rare glimpse into the occupation. Resistance fighters like Xanana Gusmão, who had taken to the mountains, are decimated. His capture in 1992 is a crushing blow. Over the next few years, atrocities continue to mount, but so does the groundswell for independence. When the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the country's de facto foreign minister, José Ramos Horta, along with East Timor's Catholic bishop, it put the country back on the international radar. Then, in 1998, a political earthquake hit Indonesia. Massive street protests saw President Suharto resign after more than 30 years in power. His replacement, President Habibie, is open to autonomy for East Timor. For the first time, there are glimmers of hope. Habibie releases Xanana from prison, and international pressure for a referendum for East Timor grows. On August 30th, 1999, the UN oversees an historic ballot. 78% of East Timorese vote for independence.
The people of East Timor have thus rejected the proposed special autonomy and expressed their wish to begin a process of transition towards independence.
But celebrations are short-lived, and Jakarta's response is swift and brutal. Indonesian-backed militias that terrorised people before the vote step up their attacks. They're aided by Indonesian security forces. Thousands are detained or killed in a 3-week campaign of terror. Hundreds of thousands are displaced, many shipped over the border to Indonesian West Timor. An Australian-led peacekeeping force arrives in late September, but the damage has already been done. Perpetrators are arrested, but towns and villages are decimated, electricity supplies destroyed, and infrastructure is in ruins. Xanana returns as the hero of the nation, and the UN governs for 3 years before he's elected president of the newly named Timor-Leste. But Xanana and his fellow revolutionaries inherit the massive task of rebuilding their new, old country. In the years that followed the referendum, this has proved a massive challenge, despite relative political stability. One potential way forward is to unlock the country's massive oil and gas reserves, but that's been embroiled in an ugly maritime dispute with Australia. For a long-suffering people, the road ahead may yet prove as hard as the battle for freedom itself.
Okay, I hope that helps to put things into perspective for you, right? To help to summarize some of the things that we are going to be looking at. Yeah. Okay, so basically, Gojal looks at the two transitions, right, being made firstly by Portugal, right, and then after that by the Indonesia's transition, yeah, to democratic transition. So basically, he looked at the nature of Portugal's democratic transition in the 1970s, right? So basically, he said that the opposition actually overthrew the government at that point in time in Portugal. So it was seen as a replacement, ruptura, a breakdown, or collapse in the current regime, in the existing regime, and as a result, a revolutionary government came into power in the transition. Yeah, and between April 1974 and 1976, there were actually 6 different provisional governments that that took over, right, in the interim. So the expectation, if you go by Stenger's assumption, right, would be that a revolutionary provisional government will pursue radical reorientation of the foreign policy. Yeah, but interestingly, right, when you examine during this period in time, there was the only foreign policy change was really in the self-determination of overseas territories. Yeah, which means Portuguese overseas territories, overseas colonies, right? Um, so basically, it was already actually one of those issues, right, that was sought, that already domestically had been debated, had been actually been pushed for, right, even before the regime change. You know? And in the new interim, I mean, in the provisional governments, right, in the interim, you see that the new civil elites and the military elites actually were aligned on, the fact that they wanted to give self-determination to the overseas territories. So that's why you see that, there was a foreign policy change. Remember that we said in the previous slide, right, that um, when there are when the individual and corporate actors actually share the same interests and see a benefit in changing the current foreign policy, the likelihood of the foreign policy being changed is much higher. Yeah. Okay. So you find that because the new civil elites and the military elites were aligned on this, right? Basically changing their foreign policy towards their overseas territories, right, and giving them self-determination. That's why this was pushed forward during the interim, during the during the revolutionary governments, right, in transition. Yeah, so basically, self-determination of East Timor was seen as the logical step, right? Because there was that international perception that the current foreign policy, right, of still hanging on to the overseas territories, despite is the Portugal actually transiting democratically, right, is seen as illegitimate. Yeah, so because it is an indication that Portugal was reluctant to let go of its overseas territories, right? And it still wants to continue to maintain itself as a colonial empire. Yeah? So this foreign policy change is in step with um, the transition, right? With the fact that Portugal was transiting from an empire into a democratic country, democratic state. Yeah, but the differences within Portugal actually arose over what was this method of self-determination that they were going to, that they were going to move ahead with, which what were they, what sort of self-determination, what is the character of the self-determination that they're going to give their overseas territories. So the initial interim government actually favored an autonomy model, right? Where basically they wanted to have a federation, right? And to basically still link Portugal with East Timor. East Timor being one of its uh, um, its state, right? One of its local states. Yeah. So it is a federation with East Timor as one of the units in the federation. Yeah. But the second provisional government opted for allowing for self-determination of the overseas territories that will lead to declaration of independence in the shortest time possible. So basically, remember that there were six provisional governments, right, over the 1974 to 1976. The second provisional government actually opted to give self-determination to the overseas territories that would allow them to subsequently declare their independence, yeah, and to be independent in the shortest time possible, yeah, as fast as possible. So there was a timeline of events that was outlined in Gorjal's article, right? He said that 27 July 1974, Law 774 was passed, recognizing the self-determination as a possible solution, to the colonial war. Then in October 1974, right, Santos was I think the leader of the first interim government, came out in favor of the wide-ranging autonomy model, but under a federal state, right? It's a federalism model. But in June 1975, there were talks that took place in Macau, right? That basically set the timetable for East Timor's self-determination. So they moved beyond just giving it, autonomy. It was, pushing it towards self-determination and then subsequently independence. So they had actually targeted 1976 as the year that East Timor would actually hold general elections for a constituent assembly, and to which will then draft the new constitution of the newly independent state thereafter. But of course, this schedule, right, of events was actually disrupted because Suharto, right, ordered the annexation. I mean, Indonesia actually annexed East Timor on 7th December 1975. All right, so East Timor became part of Indonesia. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of Gojal, looking at Portugal, right, he sees it as a disconforming case of Stanger, because he says that the revolutionary government didn't change all the foreign policy. The only foreign policy that it changed was with regard to the self-determination of its overseas territories. You know? In terms of Indonesia, right, he looked at also Indonesia's democratic transition in 1997 to 1999. Yeah. So basically, um, he saw the nature of Indonesia's democratic transition as an authoritarian, elite-led revolution, right? Actually, not really a revolution, but yeah, it was a regime change, right? So it was a transformation, it was a reformer, it was a transaction. So what you had was an incumbent government that that was a holdover from the authoritarian regime, and looming military presence, right, in the incumbent government. The military being a very important major political actor, still in Indonesia's political scene. Yeah. So May 1918, May 1998 to June 1999. That was when Habibie was formed the caretaker government. He was the head of the caretaker government. You know, so remember that Indonesia's invasion of East Timor in 1975 had been very heavily criticized, right? And of course, at that point in time, right, Suharto basically, saw that the international criticism was too acceptable because he didn't want to, he put Indonesia's sovereignty as priority, and he basically saw it as non-negotiable. So he was able to accept the international criticism, right? He didn't have any qualms about, swallowing or annexing East Timor and putting it under Indonesia. So, but then, so he was able to still ignore the international criticisms, right? Um, and basically did not feel any pressure to change his foreign policy towards East Timor. Yeah, but in 1997, with the Asian financial crisis, right, conditions were ripe for a regime change. Right, it was a favorable condition to basically, uh, you know, push for regime change, take down the Suharto government, put in place an interim government that would move, um, Indonesia towards democracy. You know, so basically, the caretaker government, right, decided that at the time, I mean, instead of actually acting the way Stanger would have predicted, that the caretaker government would not change foreign policy much, there was actually sort of, you would see this as a radical change in foreign policy, right, towards East Timor, because Habibie decided to, basically allow, right, the East Timorese, or at least the government at that point in time, the interim government, decided, right, voted to allow East Timorese to cast their ballots in a popular consultation. So basically, the interim government decided to take steps to change what was deemed as by the international community as a illegitimate policy into a legitimate one. But locally and domestically, that move to do so was actually questioned, especially by the military. Yeah. But Habibie saw it as know, a, a, a political move that would benefit him, right? Because he would be able to set himself apart from Suharto, right? He basically wanted to break away from, being seen as in the shadows, or in the image of Suharto, and he wanted to establish himself internationally, especially because there was upcoming elections, right? The very first elections to be called since the dissolving of the Suharto's government, right? The first elections was going to be up in October 1999. Yeah. So he wanted basically to set himself apart from Suharto. He thought that that would also um, increase his chances, right, of winning the elections, of being and becoming Indonesia's first democratically elected president. Mm. But like I said, right, the legitimacy of that move to allow East Timorese to cast ballots on whether or not um, they wanted autonomy, or they wanted to move towards independence, was actually seen as illegitimate by the military. It was contested domestically by the military. Okay, so this is basically the timeline of events. Yeah. So almost immediately after Habibie took over, right, the reins of the um, transitional interim government, right, because he took over basically in May 1998, right. By June 1998, he had already proposed a special autonomous status for East Timor. Right. And then between June and August, Habibie's interim government actually started to refine that proposal, put a lot more, to concretize it a little bit more, right, to make it into a actionable plan. Yeah. Then in January 1999, Habibie actually announced in Parliament that East Timorese would be allowed to vote on their autonomy proposal, on his proposal for them to have a special autonomous status within Indonesia, right? But and so in about 8 months later, in August, on 30th August 1999, East Timorese voted at that at the ballot, right? And they voted overwhelmingly to reject the autonomy proposal and to transition to independence. Yeah. So the vote was 78.5%, right, to reject the autonomy proposal, and the voter turnout was 98%. Yeah, so this is a resounding ring for independence, right? Resounding vote for independence. So basically Habibie couldn't do anything about it. The East Timorese had spoken. So by the 20th of October 1999, the Indonesia's lower house, I think NPR, basically endorsed the popular consultation outcome, endorsed the vote. Right? And on about a week later, Indonesia actually officially ended its claim over East Timor, right? By handing over a letter to I think it was at that point in time was Kofi Annan, I think, the Secretary General of UN. Yeah, so the outcome was that Habibie's strategies, right, both domestically and internationally, actually failed very miserably, and he lost his opportunity to be Indonesia's first democratically elected president. Mhm. Okay, so basically, Gurjal sees East Timor as a disconfirming case of Stange's model. Right, he said that under Portugal's transition to democracy, it was, instead of seeing, because you have a revolutionary government that came into power, right, in the transition. Instead of seeing multiple changes to foreign policy, there was only one foreign policy change that was made by the revolutionary government. You know? And under Indonesia's transition to democracy, it was an incumbent government that basically came into power, right? And you know, this unlike Stange's um, prediction, right, that incumbent governments would only will actually continue with the previous governments or previous regimes' foreign policies and not change anything very radically, right? You saw that under Habibie, the incumbent government actually undertook to make a radical foreign policy change, right? Which resulted in East Timor actually voting for independence. So Gurjal said that the nature of interim governments is not a satisfactory explanation for foreign policy initiatives or their absence during transitions to democracy. And so he proposed that basically foreign policy change, right, needs to be the analysis of foreign policy change needs to take into consideration the presence of new individual and corporate domestic evaluations and strategies of foreign policy. Yeah, so this would explain why which foreign policy initiatives were undertaken and why, and which would be resisted or not taken up at all and why. And he also noted that international perception of a state's foreign policy options also has a powerful influence in basically shaping the individual and corporate interests and strategies, and hence the foreign policy change. Okay, Any questions so far? All good? Okay, good. Yeah, I forgot to put this what do you call it, slide into the definition of what is a legitimate foreign policy, when is a what is a when is uh, or rather, okay, when is a foreign policy seen as internationally legitimate, and when is it seen as domestically legitimate? I forgot to put that slide in. I will insert it in the final slides that I'll upload to Edmodo later today. But here is the thing that Go Zhao said. Okay, second. Okay, so this is what he said. Right, a foreign policy option is considered internationally legitimate when it serves international peace and complies with the security norms and principles of international conduct. So it must conform with international laws and international norms. Yeah. And then the other thing that he also said was that okay, this is what he said about the domestic. Okay. A foreign policy is perceived as legitimate inside the country when it incorporates not only national values and beliefs but also domestic, political, and economic interests. Of course, neither interest nor policy are likely to be static, so over time, perceptions concerning international and domestic legitimacy can and usually do change. Okay, so this was what he said in his article. Yeah, so I'll put this slide into the final slides. Yeah. Okay. So this is how he defines legitimacy of a foreign policy at the international level and at the domestic level. Okay. All right. Let's see. We're at 1:15. Do you all want to take a break now? Because I'm going on to who am I going on to next? I'm going on to Ratner next. Yeah. I thought maybe this might be a good time to break. And then we can come back at say about 1:40. Would that be good? Okay. And then yeah, I will I'll see you guys at 1:40 then.